Elvis Presley was born in the poverty of Tupelo, Mississippi, but he rose to embody the American dream and its excesses. From the moment his swiveling hips set the nation aflame in the 1950s, Elvis Presley redefined music and scandalized traditional audiences. He combined rhythm and blues with gospel fervor, creating a style that felt both dangerous and irresistible. At the height of his fame, Elvis Presley commanded stages, films, and hearts across the world. Yet behind the brilliance lay a turbulent personal life, marred by dependence on prescription medication, faltering health, and the crushing demands of superstardom. By the 1970s, Graceland had become both palace and prison. Elvis Presley entertained a revolving circle of friends and hangers-on, retreating deeper into seclusion even as he continued to perform. His marriage to Priscilla Presley had collapsed, his health visibly declined, and his public appearances became a tragic spectacle. The man who had once seemed untouchable was unraveling before the eyes of those who loved him most. On August 16th of 1977, Elvis Presley was found lifeless in his bathroom at Graceland after a substance-related incident. He was only 42 years old. The shocking news spread across the globe, casting a shadow over an entire generation who had grown up with his voice. Elvis Presley's funeral drew thousands of mourners to Memphis, their grief spilling into the streets outside Graceland. He was laid to rest in the meditation garden, not far from the rooms where his voice once echoed. Today, his grave is adorned with flowers, tributes, and handwritten notes from pilgrims who still gather at dawn to remember the man hailed as the king of rock and roll. In death, Elvis Presley became both monument and myth, his grave a shrine to the fleeting brilliance of youth and the inexorable toll of excess. Michael Jackson entered the world in Gary, Indiana, and from childhood he was shaped into a prodigy. With the Jackson 5, his voice and charisma carried him beyond the confines of Motown, and soon his solo career would eclipse every boundary of genre and geography. In the 1980s, Michael Jackson released Thriller, the best-selling album in history, and became the most recognizable entertainer on earth. He transformed music videos into cinematic events, commanded stages with balletic grace, and redefined the meaning of celebrity itself. Yet that brilliance was matched by mounting controversies, financial pressures, and a personal life, scrutinized more than any other artist of his time. The later decades of Michael Jackson's life were clouded by legal battles and public suspicion. He built Neverland Ranch as both sanctuary and stage, a private kingdom that became a symbol of extravagance and eccentricity. His appearance changed dramatically, fueling speculation and ridicule, while his financial empire teetered under the weight of lawsuits and lavish spending. Despite worldwide tours and a devoted fan base, the child who had electrified the stage seemed trapped by the very spotlight that made him immortal. On June 25th of 2009, Michael Jackson collapsed in his Los Angeles home after a fatal drug-related incident involving a surgical anesthetic. He was 50 years old. The suddenness of his death stunned the world, silencing plans for a comeback tour that might have restored his reputation. Streets filled with grieving fans, and television networks carried wall-to-wall tributes for days. Michael Jackson was entombed at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California. Within the Great Mausoleum, a fortress-like resting place adorned with stained glass and marble. Unlike the carnival atmosphere of his life, his grave is quiet, private, and heavily guarded. Visitors cannot easily approach, forced to leave flowers at a respectful distance. The irony is sharp. The man who lived under the world's gaze now lies beyond reach, sealed away in silence, his music the only way to touch him. Prince Rogers Nelson was born in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and from the beginning he seemed destined to stand apart. A virtuoso on guitar, piano, and drums, Prince blended funk, rock, and soul into an audacious sound that defied categorization. By the 1980s, he had become a cultural force, creating the landmark album Purple Rain and commanding stages with a flamboyance that scandalized some and liberated others. Prince's relationships were equally vivid, from his high-profile romances to his fierce loyalty to the Minneapolis scene that had shaped him. He was more than a star. He was an architect of identity, challenging the boundaries of sexuality, style, and artistic freedom. Yet Prince's brilliance was matched by his defiance of industry control. He famously scrawled the word "slave" on his face during public appearances, battling record companies for the right to own his music. He renamed himself with an unpronounceable symbol, daring the world to follow his vision. Behind the spectacle, however, Prince lived with increasing privacy, retreating into Paisley Park, his Minnesota fortress, where he wrote, recorded, and staged concerts in an environment entirely his own. On April 21st of 2016, Prince was found lifeless in an elevator inside Paisley Park after a drug-related incident involving powerful opioids. He was 57 years old. The sudden loss shocked the world, not only because of his age, but because he had seemed indestructible, an artist untouched by time or convention. Prince was cremated in a private ceremony, and his ashes were placed inside an urn shaped like Paisley Park, later displayed within the complex itself. His grave is not open to the public, a fitting symbol of the guarded privacy he maintained in life. Fans still travel from across the world to leave flowers outside the gates, peering into the gleaming white walls of his compound. The man who once seemed limitless rests now in secrecy, his music the only way the public can continue to enter his world. John Winston Lennon was born in Liverpool, England, and from his earliest days, he carried both wit and rebellion in equal measure. With the Beatles, John Lennon helped ignite the cultural revolution of the 1960s, marrying sharp lyricism with an instinct for provocation. His partnership with Paul McCartney created songs that defined an era. Yet it was John Lennon's restless spirit that often pushed the band into uncharted territory. Beyond music, his relationship with Yoko Ono became both muse and lightning rod, sparking controversy as they campaigned for peace while defying public expectations. When the Beatles dissolved in 1970, John Lennon entered a turbulent solo career. He poured his frustrations, politics, and personal struggles into songs that alternated between tenderness and rage. His outspoken stance against the Vietnam War and his advocacy for global peace made him both admired and vilified. In New York City, he found refuge, living with Yoko Ono in the Dakota apartment building, raising their son Sean Lennon, and embracing the possibility of a quieter life. That life was cut short on December 8th of 1980, when John Lennon was shot outside the Dakota by a disturbed admirer. He was 40 years old. News of his violent death traveled instantly across the world, leaving millions in disbelief. A man who had preached love and peace had fallen to senseless violence, a cruel irony that darkened the close of the decade. John Lennon was cremated, and his ashes were scattered in Central Park, near the area later dedicated as Strawberry Fields. Today, fans from across the globe gather around the Imagine mosaic, leaving flowers, candles, and handwritten notes. There is no grave, only a living memorial in the heart of Manhattan. The man who sought to give the world peace found his eternity not in stone, but in memory, his absence haunting the very park where his spirit lingers still. David Robert Jones, known to the world as David Bowie, was born in Brixton, London, and from the outset he seemed destined to inhabit multiple lives. With each new persona, from Ziggy Stardust to the Thin White Duke, David Bowie challenged the boundaries of music, fashion, and identity. He was a shapeshifter, a performer who made reinvention itself his greatest art. His relationships were equally striking, from his high-profile marriages to his collaborations with artists who, like him, sought to tear down conventions. By the 1970s, David Bowie had become both rock star and cultural philosopher, embodying the chaos and freedom of his time. Behind the glamour, however, lay a man fiercely private, wrestling with the weight of fame and the demands of constant reinvention. He lived between continents, slipping from London to Berlin to New York, each city shaping a new chapter of his artistry. In later years, David Bowie cultivated a quiet domestic life with his wife, Iman, while still producing music that startled and astonished. Even in illness, he crafted Black Star, a haunting farewell disguised as art, filled with cryptic lyrics that hinted at what he already knew. On January 10th of 2016, David Bowie died in New York City from liver cancer, a struggle hidden from almost everyone. He was 69 years old. The news broke like thunder, shattering the illusion of immortality that seemed to surround him. Fans mourned across the globe, stunned that the man who had made transformation eternal could no longer transform again. David Bowie was cremated in secrecy, with no public funeral, and his ashes were scattered quietly in accordance with his wishes. There is no grave, no monument in stone. His final act was a vanishing, a refusal to be pinned down even in death. The irony endures. A man who lived through masks and reinventions left behind nothing but music and myth, a disappearance as theatrical as his life. Farrokh Bulsara, known to the world as Freddie Mercury, was born in Zanzibar and raised in India before finding his destiny in England. From the beginning, Freddie Mercury carried a voice of astonishing power and a presence that could command stadiums. With Queen, he transformed rock into opera, spectacle, and theater, composing anthems that blended grandiosity with intimacy. His relationships, particularly with Mary Austin, revealed both passion and heartbreak, as he navigated a life lived in the public eye and in private secrecy. Freddie Mercury's fame was inseparable from scandal and fascination. His unapologetic flamboyance, his defiance of traditional masculinity, and his relentless creativity made him both adored and criticized. In the 1980s, as Queen's music conquered global stages, Freddie Mercury's health began to falter. He retreated into his Kensington home, cloaked in secrecy as rumors swirled about his condition. The man who once declared he would be a legend seemed to vanish from public life, his voice recorded in the shadows of a studio, while his body weakened. On November 24th of 1991, Freddie Mercury died from complications of AIDS at the age of 45, only one day after confirming his illness to the world. His passing struck like a hammer blow, silencing one of the greatest voices of the century and casting new light on a disease shrouded in stigma. Freddie Mercury was cremated at Kensal Green Crematorium in London, and the location of his ashes remains a mystery. Mary Austin, entrusted with his remains, is said to have scattered them in secret, leaving no permanent grave for fans to visit. Instead, mourners gather outside Garden Lodge, his former home, scrawling messages on the walls and leaving flowers at the gate. The irony is piercing. The man who filled stadiums with thunderous anthems left behind only whispers of his final resting place, his grave transformed into myth, his legacy louder than any stone. Kurt Donald Cobain was born in Aberdeen, Washington, and from an early age he carried both sensitivity and rebellion. With Nirvana, Kurt Cobain ignited the grunge movement, a sound that blended punk ferocity with raw vulnerability. His relationship with Courtney Love became one of the most volatile romances in modern rock, celebrated and vilified in equal measure. Together, they embodied a generation's disillusionment, living in a storm of artistry, addiction, and relentless media scrutiny. Fame brought no peace. Kurt Cobain recoiled from the machinery of success, haunted by the pressure to remain a reluctant spokesman for a disaffected youth. His struggles with chronic pain, substance dependence, and the crushing spotlight left him increasingly withdrawn. Though Nirvana's Nevermind and In Utero cemented his place in history, the man behind the music seemed unable to endure the burden his own brilliance had created. On April 5th of 1994, Kurt Cobain died in Seattle by self-inflicted harm. He was only 27 years old, joining the tragic 27 Club of artists whose brilliance burned too briefly. The news spread like wildfire, leaving millions stunned, as if the voice of their own frustration and longing had been extinguished. Kurt Cobain was cremated, and his ashes were divided, some kept by family and others scattered in rivers near his Washington home. There is no single grave, only makeshift memorials in Aberdeen and Seattle where fans still gather. The irony is stark. A man who rejected monuments to fame became one himself, with absence as his gravestone. His songs remain the only permanent marker carved into the memory of a generation that still whispers his words. Whitney Elizabeth Houston was born in Newark, New Jersey, into a family steeped in gospel tradition. The daughter of singer Cissy Houston and cousin of Dionne Warwick, Whitney Houston carried a voice that seemed to descend from heaven itself. By the 1980s, she had become the most awarded female artist in history, her ballads soaring across radio waves and film screens alike. Her relationship with Bobby Brown became both passionate and destructive, entangling her golden career with scandal and heartbreak. Behind the glamour of red carpets and platinum albums, Whitney Houston wrestled with the relentless demands of fame and the lure of substances that eroded her once unmatched voice. Public appearances grew erratic, her performances faltered, and the world watched with disbelief as one of its brightest stars dimmed before their eyes. The woman who had once seemed untouchable revealed in her fragility the crushing cost of greatness. On February 11th of 2012, Whitney Houston was found lifeless in a Beverly Hills hotel bathtub after a substance-related incident complicated by heart disease. She was 48 years old. The suddenness of her death cast a pall over the Grammy Awards that very weekend, turning celebration into collective mourning. Whitney Houston was laid to rest at Fairview Cemetery in Westfield, New Jersey, beside her father. Her grave, simple yet adorned with tributes, draws fans who leave flowers and notes in remembrance. In a cruel irony, the voice celebrated as eternal was silenced too soon, leaving only echoes of songs that continue to swell with both triumph and sorrow. James Douglas Morrison was born in Melbourne, Florida, and from the beginning he seemed drawn toward both poetry and chaos. As the frontman of The Doors, Jim Morrison embodied rebellion, draped in leather and intoxicated with his own words. His relationship with Pamela Courson was as stormy as his stage persona, filled with devotion, jealousy, and destructive indulgence. Together, they inhabited a world where music, love, and excess collided in ways both exhilarating and perilous. Jim Morrison's career burned like a wildfire. His concerts were notorious for scandal and spectacle, his lyrics laced with mysticism and menace. To some, he was a prophet of the counterculture, while to others, he was a symbol of decadence spiraling out of control. By the early 1970s, his life in America had become suffocating, hounded by legal troubles and the unrelenting gaze of the public. He fled to Paris with Pamela Courson, seeking anonymity in narrow streets and smoky cafes, hoping the city of poets would restore his fading spirit. On July 3rd of 1971, Jim Morrison was found dead in the bathtub of his Paris apartment. He was 27 years old, claimed by a sudden heart failure, though questions lingered over substance involvement. The news stunned fans, cementing his place in the infamous 27 Club. The wild poet who had sung of breaking through to the other side had crossed it himself. Jim Morrison was buried in Père Lachaise Cemetery, resting among poets, philosophers, and artists. His grave, at first unmarked, became a site of pilgrimage, eventually encased in stone to contain the tide of mourners who scrawled graffiti and left offerings. Today, the grave remains one of the most visited in Paris, a shrine where silence and chaos mingle. The irony is undeniable. A man who defied order and authority lies now under watchful stone, remembered not for restraint, but for the eternal echo of his voice. James Marshall Hendrix was born in Seattle, Washington, and from the moment he first touched a guitar, he seemed to speak a new language. Jimi Hendrix transformed rock into something elemental, bending strings into flames and conjuring soundscapes no one had heard before. His performances at Monterey and Woodstock remain immortal, where he set not only his guitar, but the entire stage ablaze with raw power. Relationships filled his life with turbulence and inspiration, yet fame often isolated him, leaving him caught between genius and exhaustion. Jimi Hendrix lived with an intensity that could not be sustained. The relentless touring, the pressures of sudden superstardom, and a growing reliance on substances weighed heavily on him. Behind the spectacle of wild performances was a young man weary of the machinery of success. His songs spoke of freedom, of castles made of sand, yet his life felt trapped in currents he could not control. On September 18th of 1970, Jimi Hendrix died in London after a drug-related incident that left him unable to recover. He was only 27 years old, another brilliant light extinguished at the same haunting age as so many of his peers. The news shocked the world, and his death seemed to mark the end of an era already steeped in loss. Jimi Hendrix was buried at Greenwood Memorial Park in Renton, Washington, beneath a towering granite dome engraved with his likeness and lyrics. The memorial is both shrine and sanctuary, where fans kneel before etched guitars and inscribed words. The irony is profound. A man whose music defied boundaries rests within a stone monument, forever still. Yet at his grave, the silence vibrates, as if his guitar still hums faintly through the earth. Thomas Earl Petty was born in Gainesville, Florida, where a battered guitar and a restless heart carried him toward destiny. With the Heartbreakers, Tom Petty forged a sound that married Southern storytelling with defiant rock energy, a voice both nasal and soulful that became instantly recognizable. His songs told tales of resilience, freedom, and heartbreak, earning him a place as one of America's most trusted troubadours. His marriage to Jane Benyo, followed by his later relationship with Dana York, revealed the quieter battles behind the music, as fame and personal struggles pulled constantly at his spirit. Tom Petty's career stretched across decades, weathering shifting trends with stubborn independence. He stood against record companies that sought to exploit him, refusing to compromise his art even when lawsuits and financial pressure mounted. In the twilight of his career, he continued to sell out arenas, his voice still carrying the same grit and honesty that had defined him since the 1970s. Yet behind the curtain, Tom Petty's health was faltering, and pain management became a constant companion. On October 2nd of 2017, Tom Petty died in Los Angeles after a drug-related incident involving prescription painkillers. He was 66 years old. His death came only days after completing a triumphant tour, silencing a voice that had always seemed inseparable from the American highway. Fans across the nation played his songs on car radios, turning grief into an impromptu chorus that stretched from coast to coast. Tom Petty was laid to rest at a private ceremony in Pacific Palisades, California. His grave remains largely hidden from the public, a reflection of the humility that belied his fame. The irony endures. A man whose music, belonged to everyone rests in near secrecy, his final home unknown to many. Yet every time Free Fallin' or American Girl plays, his voice rises again, an anthem carried on the wind like a restless spirit refusing silence. Edward Lodewijk Van Halen was born in Amsterdam and raised in Pasadena, California, where he and his brother Alex began forging a sound that would change rock forever. With the formation of Van Halen, Eddie Van Halen unleashed a guitar style that seemed almost supernatural, inventing techniques that left audiences in awe and inspired generations of musicians. His marriage to Valerie Bertinelli and later his relationship with Janie Lisewski placed his private life under the same spotlight as his music, revealing both tenderness and turmoil behind the scenes. On stage, Eddie Van Halen was a force of nature, his hands a blur as he transformed the electric guitar into an instrument of limitless expression. Yet away from the spotlight, he wrestled with decades of health struggles, including battles with addiction and recurring cancer. His brilliance never dimmed, but his life became a constant fight between artistic triumph and physical decline. By the late 2000s, fans watched anxiously as his body weakened, even as his sound remained fierce. On October 6th of 2020, Eddie Van Halen died in Santa Monica, California, after a long battle with throat cancer. He was 65 years old. The world of rock reeled at the loss of a man whose solos had seemed immortal, whose eruption had redefined what a guitar could say. His passing closed the book on an era of pure, unfiltered showmanship. Eddie Van Halen was cremated, and his ashes were given to his son, Wolfgang Van Halen. In a poignant gesture, those ashes are set to be scattered at sea, fulfilling his final wish. There is no permanent grave, only the memory carried by his family and the eternal sound of his guitar. The irony is sharp. A man whose music was carved into the bedrock of rock history chose the vast ocean as his resting place, dissolving into infinity, as if his riffs were waves still crashing against the shore. Charles Edward Anderson Barry was born in St. Louis, Missouri, and his guitar became the spark that ignited rock and roll itself. Long before others claimed the crown, Chuck Berry shaped the language of the genre, from driving riffs to the swaggering strut that became his signature. Songs like Johnny B. Good and Roll Over Beethoven carved the blueprint for everything that followed, their stories of teenage rebellion and restless energy echoing through decades. His marriage to Themeta Suggs endured for nearly 70 years, a steady presence against the backdrop of his often tumultuous career. Chuck Berry's brilliance was inseparable from controversy. Legal troubles and prison sentences punctuated his life, underscoring the tension between his role as rock's architect and the man behind the music. Yet, despite scandal and shifting musical trends, he endured, still duck-walking across stages well into his 80s. His impact was undeniable, influencing the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and nearly every guitarist who came after him. On March 18th of 2017, Chuck Berry died at his Missouri home at the age of 90. His passing marked the end of the original rock and roll era, silencing the man who had once declared that music would never die. Tributes poured in from around the globe, each one acknowledging him as the foundation upon which modern rock had been built. Chuck Berry was laid to rest at St. Louis's Bellefontaine Cemetery, his grave a pilgrimage site for musicians and fans alike. The man who had set music in motion now lies beneath Midwestern soil, his headstone etched with guitars and lyrics. The irony is plain. The restless voice of youthful rebellion is now stilled in quiet earth, but his riffs continue to roll forward, eternal as the beat he once commanded. Richard Wayne Penniman, known to the world as Little Richard, was born in Macon, Georgia, in 1932. From his earliest days, his flamboyant style and thunderous voice set him apart. With hits like Tutti Frutti and Long Tall Sally, Little Richard helped ignite rock and roll, blending gospel shouts with pounding piano riffs that felt both dangerous and divine. His wild costumes, heavy makeup, and electrifying performances scandalized conservative audiences while inspiring a generation of artists from Elvis Presley to the Beatles. His relationships and public identity, often at odds with the rigid morality of his time, added layers of conflict to a life already bursting with contradictions. Yet, for all his brilliance, Little Richard lived in tension between faith and fame. He often renounced rock and roll, retreating into religious devotion, only to return again to the music that defined him. Lawsuits over royalties and questions of recognition haunted him, even as he remained an undisputed pioneer. In later years, frailty replaced flamboyance, but his presence remained larger than life, the architect of a genre that could never quite contain him. On May 9th of 2020, Little Richard died in Tullahoma, Tennessee, from bone cancer. He was 87 years old. The news reverberated across the world, reminding millions that the foundation of modern rock had been laid by a man both celebrated and misunderstood. Little Richard was buried at Oakwood University Cemetery in Huntsville, Alabama, on the grounds of the Seventh-day Adventist institution where he once studied theology. His grave is modest, surrounded by the quiet dignity of a religious campus. The irony is sharp. The man who once screamed rebellion from a stage now rests in solemn earth, his headstone bearing the name of a legend who refused to be forgotten. Anna Mae Bullock, known to the world as Tina Turner, was born in Nutbush, Tennessee in 1939. From humble beginnings, she rose to become one of the most electrifying performers in history, her voice a force of raw power and her stage presence unmatched. In the 1960s and 70s, alongside Ike Turner, she delivered hits that shook audiences, yet behind the spotlight was a marriage filled with abuse and humiliation. Her eventual escape from that relationship became one of the most public and courageous reinventions in popular music. In the 1980s, Tina Turner staged a comeback few thought possible. With Private Dancer, she reclaimed her crown, striding across global stages in leather skirts and high heels, her voice roaring like fire. She became an icon of endurance, her relationships rebuilt, and her career elevated beyond what anyone had imagined. Yet even in triumph, she faced health struggles and heartbreak, including the loss of her son Craig to self-inflicted death, and later, the passing of her younger son Ronnie. The storms of her private life shadowed the brilliance of her public one. On May 24th of 2023, Tina Turner died at her estate in Küsnacht, Switzerland, after a long illness. She was 83 years old. Her death ended a career that spanned 6 decades, silencing the voice that had once been called the Queen of Rock and Roll. Tina Turner was cremated in Switzerland, and her ashes were laid to rest near her home overlooking Lake Zurich. Her grave, adorned with flowers and candles, has become a shrine for fans who travel across the world to honor her. The irony endures. A woman who fought to escape the shadows of her past found her eternal peace far from her native America. Her grave, a quiet sanctuary in the land where she finally discovered freedom.